All right, let me welcome you to session number 3 in the Awake to Israel conference. And you can see from our opening slide here where we are in terms of our presentations. Chapter 36, you'll recall, is a tremendous prophecy that we covered in session 1 concerning Israel's physical and spiritual restoration. Chapter 37 is two illustrations of what's described in Ezekiel 36. And it's described through the word pictures of the two sticks coming together so that they're a single stick, and then, of course, the vision of the valley of the dry bones. And now we're moving in from there into chapter 38, which follows nicely as well, because chapter 38 is the tool or the means that God is going to use to orchestrate this final restoration that's described in Ezekiel 36 and 37. So how is God going to do this? Well, the answer is in chapter 38, the prophecy of the northern invasion. We have entitled this Israel's Darkest Hour. And so this northern invasion in Israel's darkest hour is the tool or the means that God is going to use to orchestrate this end-time restoration of the nation. As you look at our second slide, here is our outline of this northern invasion. You'll notice that this outline goes into chapter 39, and so we're going to cut off towards the end in the middle of this outline and cover the contents of chapter 39 in our next and fourth and final session. But here's the whole thing and what it looks like. You have an invasion plan, verses 1 through 13, an invasion executed, verses 14 through 16, and then the invasion defeated, chapter 38, verse 17, through chapter 39, verse 20, and then finally is the invasion's results, chapter 39, verses 21 through 29. So let's go ahead and start off with the invasion planned. Notice, if you will, Ezekiel chapter 38, verses 1 through 13. Now, as we look at the invasion planned, there's two parts to it. God's intention, verses 1 through 13, and Gog's intention, verses 10 through 13. So let's start off with God's intention. Why is God? What is the intention of God through this northern invasion? We have a description of it there in verses 1 through 9. Notice, if you will, Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 1 as we seek to, in this session, work through this chapter verse by verse. It says, "And the word of the Lord came to me, saying," so this is now a fresh oracle that God gave to Ezekiel, describing the catalyst that God is going to use to bring about the prophesied results that we've already studied in Ezekiel 36 and 37. Notice verse 2 as we start getting the names of the players in this end-time invasion. It says, "Son of man, set your face towards Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him." Notice this map here, which gives you essentially the nations that are going to invade Israel in the end times according to Ezekiel's prophecy. We're going to seek to identify all of these nations in this session. In fact, here is a slide here. It says ancient names from Ezekiel 38 and 39. And we're going to try to identify all of these nations in this particular session. But you'll notice that the first player mentioned is an entity called Gog. Who is Gog? Well, dropping down, you'll see that Gog is a prince. So most people take Gog as the leader, the human leader of this end-time northern coalition that's going to come against Israel. You know, if the rapture were to take place in the next split second, I would say this, that Gog, the human leader, is probably Putin. Of course, we have no guarantee that the rapture will take place in the next split second. Perhaps another world leader will come upon the scene. But Putin, if he isn't Gog, he is certainly, most recently, certainly acting Gog-like. Now, all of these players and names you'll find in Genesis 10. Genesis 10 is a description of where Noah's descendants settled following the flood. And all we really have to do is figure out where those people groups mentioned in Genesis 10 settled. And the modern nations containing those people groups are, in fact, the nations that will invade Israel in the end times. We can figure out who they are not by newspaper exegesis, reading the current newspaper events back into the Bible, but we can figure out who they are objectively through the scholarly method. And what you discover is Josephus in his Antiquities and Herodotus in his histories tell us where these people groups eventually settled. And so the modern nations containing those people groups are in fact the players that Ezekiel saw in terms of this northern invasion in the end times. You'll notice that one of the players mentioned there is an entity called Magog. You'll notice that Josephus in his Antiquities tells us that the Magogs, or Magogites I should say, are synonymous with a group of people called the Scythians. And we know from history that the Scythians migrated from Central Asia to southern Russia just a little before the time of Ezekiel in the 8th to the 7th century BC. And so we believe that Magog would represent the people groups of Central Asia. Names like the Ukraine would be part of that group. And of course, the Stans. There are many groups ending with the name Stan. Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, etc. So Magog is Central Asia. And then he mentions a second group here, verse 2, called Rosh. And here we draw from the work of Gesenius. Wilhelm Gesenius was no lightweight. He was a scholar's scholar, and he is known as the modern-day father of lexicography, Hebrew lexicography, which is the science and art of compiling Hebrew dictionaries. And you'll notice that in his work, he identifies Rosh as, he says here, undoubtedly the Russians. Now, it's very interesting that he made this statement in 1847, which was during a time period when Israel didn't even exist, and it was during a time period when Russia was a Christian Orthodox country. The communist revolution of 1917 hadn't even occurred yet, and Russia hadn't even come upon the scene as a modern-day nuclear superpower that we know it today. And so it's interesting that you can't accuse Gesenius of doing newspaper exegesis. He's not reading current events into the Bible. He's using scholarly sources to identify who Rosh is. And he says here, Rosh is undoubtedly the Russians. And then you have this next name mentioned, this entity called Meshech. Josephus in his Antiquities identifies Meshech or Meshach with the Cappadocians. Now that should ring a bell because Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, wrote his first letter to a group of people, but one of the groups mentioned is the Cappadocians. And Cappadocia, according to this map here, is located in an area called today modern-day Turkey. So Peter wrote that book to a group of people in South and Central Asia Minor, and today that is modern-day Turkey. Now it's interesting that Herodotus in his writings, in his famous book called Histories, you'll notice the date on it, 450 BC. It's just a little over a century after the time of Ezekiel. Herodotus identifies Meshach and Tubal. Notice that both names are mentioned there in verse 2. Meshach and Tubal as a group of people living in the mountains southeast of the Black Sea, which again would be modern-day Turkey. So we're starting to see the names develop here in terms of who is going to be invading Israel in the last days. Let's continue on into verse 3 of Ezekiel 38, and it says this, "And say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal." So Ezekiel is told by God to prophesy against this northern coalition. That's why he's given a fresh oracle, as we saw earlier in verse 1. And moving on into verse 4, notice what it says, "I will turn you about and put hooks into your jaws, and I will bring you out." Now, it's interesting that we read about this northern invasion and we see how horrible this is, that these human leaders are doing this thing here to Israel in the last days. But it's actually not just these human leaders that's working. It's God using these human leaders. It's God summoning this northern coalition into the land of Israel. And God is using Satan's program to accomplish his results, but it's really God behind the scenes working. That's what the hooks in the jaws, or hooks in the jaw, is all about. Now, what that hook is, we're going to see it in verse 12. We haven't gotten there yet. But we're going to connect verse 4, the hook in the jaw, to verse 12, and we'll see exactly what God is going to use as an incentive to draw these nations into Israel in the last days. But continuing on here with verse 4, it goes on and it says, "And all your army and horses and horsemen, all of them splendidly attired, a great company with buckler and shield, all of them wielding swords." Now, many people are troubled by this because when it mentions horses and buckler and shield and swords and these kinds of things, it looks like an ancient army or ancient armament, and they say there's no way this could be describing a future battle with ancient weapons like this. But what's so interesting to note is ancient weaponry like this is actually used in modern day warfare. In fact, in my book, The Middle East Meltdown, I quote someone who wrote an article for Prophetic Witness magazine who talks about how our own CIA here in the United States of America actually shipped horses from the state of Tennessee into the Middle East around 1981 because only a horse could do well in that kind of terrain to fight a skirmish or a battle that the United States was involved in at that time. And so the idea of horses here shouldn't automatically cause us to conclude this couldn't be describing a modern day conflict. In fact, Paul Lee Tan, in his excellent book, The Interpretation of Prophecy, says this, "Interestingly, those prophesied military instruments, though centuries old, have not been made obsolete. The horse, for instance, is still used in warfare on certain kinds of terrain." Notice this quote here from Charles Feinberg in his Ezekiel commentary. He says, "Some have found great difficulty in the reference to armor, buckler, shield, sword, and helmet, but even in our day of advanced weapons of warfare, it is interesting to learn that in some parts of the world, conflict is going on with primitive weapons." And how else could an ancient writer have described warfare? He knew nothing of planes and guns. So you have a couple of ways of handling this ancient warfare. One way is simply saying, well, Ezekiel didn't know the word gun or plane or tank, so he describes it in terminology he would understand. That's one possibility, but another possibility is perhaps Ezekiel was meant to be understood literally here. I've already given some reasons why I kind of lean towards the latter. I think Ezekiel could be actually describing something very literal, a war breaking out involving ancient weapons, including horses and the like. But notice, if you will, verse 5, as Ezekiel continues to describe the players in this great end-time invasion. He says, verse 5, Persia, Ethiopia, and put with them all of them with shield and helmet. Now notice he makes reference to Persia. Persia has a paper trail in the Bible. We know who Persia was. Persia was the chest and arms of silver that followed Babylon, the head of gold, as given in Daniel 2. Here is a picture of the statue, which would eventually be crushed one day by God's kingdom. The head of gold is Babylon. The chest and arms of silver would represent the Medo-Persian Empire. It's interesting that Persia was one of the good guys in biblical times. Here's a picture of the Cyrus cylinder. It was Cyrus, the Persian, that God raised up not only to conquer Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, but to actually release the nation of Israel from the 70-year captivity just around or just after the time of Ezekiel. And in fact, you'll notice this chart here called the three returns. These are the returns of the nation of Israel from the 70-year captivity as recorded in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And they went back in three waves, and it was under Persian authority that the nation of Israel went back from the Babylonian captivity back into their homeland. And it's very interesting that Persia continued on as a modern-day country, and her name was changed to Iran in 1935. Now, from 1935 to 1979, you have to understand that Iran was an ally of the United States and was actually an ally of the nation of Israel when she was rebirthed in 1948. And so Ezekiel's prophecies probably seemed absurd to him because he saw Persia turning against the nation of Israel in the last days. And I believe it was in 1979 that history began to catch up with Ezekiel's prophecies, because it was at that time that the Shah was deposed and replaced by the Ayatollah, and Persia or Iran became Islamicized. It became a Shiite Muslim theocracy. In fact, these two pictures here shows you what Iran was like prior to 1979. It was a modern day country, and look at it today at the bottom. It's a Islamic dictatorship operating under Sharia law. In fact, I have this lengthy quote here from Yoram Edinger, which I don't think I have time to read, but it basically is about Iran's school textbooks, and it talks about the things that children in Iran are taught in terms of the fact that a final jihad is going to take place not only against the nation of Israel, but against the United States. My point in bringing up all of these things is simply to show how history has finally caught up to Ezekiel's prophecies. So Persia is mentioned, verse 5. Another entity mentioned is Cush. Now I'm reading out of the New American Standard Bible, and Cush is translated as Ethiopia, Why does the New American Standard Bible do that in its English translation? Well, it relates to what Josephus said in his Antiquities, where Josephus identified Cush with Ethiopia. And you'll notice this entry by Philip Johnson from the Wycliffe Bible Encyclopedia, and he says this: the designation Ethiopia is misleading, for it did not refer to the modern state of Ethiopia. Cush bordered Egypt on the south, or the modern-day Sudan. And so we largely believe that the Sudan is what Ezekiel saw as one of these invaders as part of this coalition in the end times. And we continue on there in verse 5, and he mentions also Put. You'll notice also that Josephus identifies Put with Libya in his Antiquities. And so we believe that Libya, modern-day Libya, is a player in this end-time invasion. Let's go ahead and continue, and let's move into verse 6. It says, Gomer from all its troops, or Beth Togarmah. We have a couple of other players here. One of them is named Gomer. Josephus in his Antiquities identifies Gomer with Galatia. And we know who Galatia was from this map here. Galatia is the group of people that the Apostle Paul was addressing from Syrian Antioch. Following his first missionary journey, Galatia also is modern-day Turkey. And you'll notice also that Ezekiel mentions, going back to verse 6, not just Gomer, but Beth Togarmah. The word Beth there is simply house of Togarmah. So who is Togarmah? Josephus identifies Togarmah with a group of people called the Phrygians. Paul the Apostle in Acts 16 and verse 6 passed through Phrygia. Where exactly was Phrygia? Well, it also is in modern-day Turkey. So it's very interesting that we have 4 names on the list here: Meshach, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah, representing modern-day Turkey. And it's interesting how modern-day Turkey is fitting into the blueprint of this invasion, just like Rosh or Russia is, and just like Persia is, and the other names we've spoken of here. Frank Gaffney writes this, previewing what Gaffney says. It says, according to Frank Gaffney, president of the Center for Security Policy, Turkey is transitioning from, quote, a secular democracy with a Muslim society into a state governed by radical Islamic ideology and hostile to Western values and freedoms. In fact, here is an article here talking about how Turkey's leader, Erdogan, has now assumed new sweeping powers. Here is a quote here from Turkish President and Prime Minister, and he talks about this: we will gather together all of the Muslim world and invade Jerusalem. It's very interesting how Turkey was a place where Israelis used to go on their vacations. But now Turkey is turning against Israel, exactly like Ezekiel saw. Here is an article here from the Daily Express talking about how the EU has rejected Turkey for membership. If Turkey is rejected by the EU, then it stands to reason that they would be part of a different coalition, a northern coalition, not a Western power, but a northern coalition that would invade Israel in the end times. And so it's quite interesting to see all of these things develop. Continuing on with verse 6, from the remote parts of the north, it says. Now, looking at our map again, the remote parts of the north, and by the way, it mentions the remote north over and over again in these chapters. verse 6, verse 15. It mentions it again in chapter 39, verse 2. And just look at this map here as you go from the land of Israel and go into the remote north. Not only first do you run into Turkey, but you also, going further north, run into Rosh, who we believe is Russia. Charles Feinberg, concerning Russia, makes this statement in his Ezekiel commentary. He says, the area of origin was stated as out of the uttermost parts, the farthest reaches of the north. It was well known who has been dominant in this region of the world ever since the end of the last global conflict, an area which has actually kept the entire world in turmoil constantly. Russia is a power that must be reckoned with now, and surely will figure largely in the events that lie ahead, especially when the church is raptured to her risen Lord. Now, when you look again at verse 6, the very end of the verse, it says, with all its troops, with many peoples with you. In other words, this list of nations is not exhaustive. There are other nations coming with this northern invasion to invade Israel in the end times. And that's important because a lot of the nations mentioned in the inner ring are not mentioned. What we've studied so far is nations mentioned in the outer ring. But notice this map here entitled the Arab Confederacy, there's a lot of nations that weren't mentioned, like Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and they could easily be part of this invasion as well. It's just that Ezekiel doesn't discuss them. And so a lot of people are postulating today that there's two invasions, one called the Psalm 83 war invasion, and then there's another invasion called the Gog-Magog invasion. I'm really not in that camp. I don't see two wars here. What I see is Ezekiel is describing an invasion, and then he also says there are other powers that will accompany the nations in the outer ring. And those other powers could easily include the inner ring simultaneously. But just by way of review, take a look at our ancient names from Ezekiel chapter 38, verses 1 through 9. Magog is Central Asia, Rosh is Russia, Meshach and Tubal are Turkey, Persia is Iran, Put is Libya, Cush is the Sudan, Gomer and Togarmah represent modern-day Turkey, and let's stop the count there because we're going to have more to say about some other names later. But here's what they look like on a map. And one of the things that's very interesting is what unites all of these nations, with the possible exception of Rosh or Russia, is Islam. Islam essentially teaches that Israel's existence is a usurpation and a disrespect to Allah. And therefore, Islam furnishes the political ideology necessary to furnish the motivation for this end-time invasion. What's very interesting as you study this list is not only does Israel exist now, not only do these nations exist, not only are they turning against Israel largely because of Islam, but they are actually cooperating with each other. Here's an article here from the Russian news agency, and it talks about Putin, Russia's military base in Tajikistan. So there you see an alliance forming between Russia and Central Asia. This is exactly the kind of thing that Ezekiel saw 2,600 years ago. You'll notice a similar article from Eurasia Daily. It talks about Russia and Uzbekistan hold first joint military exercise in 12 years. You'll notice this particular article here from The Diplomat. it says checking in with Moscow, and it mentions those nations in Central Asia forming an alliance with Russia. You'll notice this particular article from the AFP News. It says Putin meets with Sudanese president. There's the formation of the alliance between Russia and Cush, exactly what Ezekiel saw. You'll notice this picture here of the big three, and here the leader of Turkey, the leader of Iran, and the leader of Russia are holding a joint photo session together. This is exactly what Ezekiel saw 2,600 years ago. Here is an article from Seth Frantzman from the Jerusalem Post, and it's an analysis article, and it talks about Russia, Iran, and Turkey meeting together is a message to the U.S. And so it's a fascinating time that we're living in, where not only do these nations exist, not only do they have a hostile intent towards Israel, but they are all cooperating with one another. Here is a similar article which talks about a meeting between Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Here is a similar article of Turkey from the Daily Sabah, where it talks about the Turkey, Iran, and Russia meeting together in Syria, which is on Israel's northern border. And so, my goodness, we're certainly living in a time period when Ezekiel's prophecies, history has caught up to the time period that Ezekiel was speaking of. Let's continue on, if we could, into verse 7. It says, "Be prepared and prepare yourself, you and all your companies that are assembled about, and be a guard for them." So these armies are being prepared for battle, but the battle belongs to the Lord. Proverbs 21 verse 31 says, "The horse is prepared for the day of battle, but the victory belongs to the Lord." These nations can prepare all they want to invade Israel, but God is going to have the final word. Notice, if you will, as we move into Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 8. It says, "After many days you will be summoned in the latter years. You will come into the land that is restored from the sword, whose inhabitants have been gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which have been a continual waste. But its people were brought out from the nations, and they are living securely, all of them." Notice that Ezekiel talks about this invasion happening in the latter years. Now, you'll notice that we have 6 timing clues concerning when this invasion takes place. And this is how we know it's an end-time invasion. And one of our clues that we have is this invasion, verse 8, is going to take place in the latter times. You'll notice also in verse 8 that these nations are going to come into the land of Israel after Israel has been brought out from amongst the nations of the earth. You see, under the Mosaic covenant, here are the 6 parts, and we've covered this before, of a suzerain vassal treaty. The 6th and final part are prophecies of blessings and cursings. We see the cursing spelled out in Deuteronomy 28, verses 15 through 68. And at the height of those curses, Deuteronomy 28, verses 49 and 50, it indicates that God is going to bring a foreign nation against his people by way of discipline and to push them into worldwide dispersion. We believe that this worldwide dispersion happened at the hands of the Romans about 40 years after the time of Christ, as spelled out in Luke chapter 19, verses 41 through 44. So Ezekiel is predicting a time period when the nation of Israel is going to be regathered from this worldwide dispersion and be brought back into their land. and then this invasion will occur. It's so interesting to me that it says this invasion will occur when Israel has been restored from the sword. It's very interesting to me to note that the sword is the universal symbol of Islam. And Islam, of course, in the Quran teaches caliphate. It teaches the conquest of the world via the sword. In fact, if you look at this map here, the green areas represent Islamic countries. That little tiny dot represents the nation of Israel. And Ezekiel says this invasion will occur when Israel has been regathered from the sword, which may be a reference to Islam. And they're living back in their own country and their own territory. And then this end time invasion will occur. You'll notice Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 8 talks about the inhabitants will have been gathered from many nations. So this is not talking about the return from Babylon. As you can see from this map here, the return from Babylon was just a return from one geographical locale. That's not what Ezekiel is predicting here. He's talking about a time when Israel has been in worldwide dispersion and is regathered from many nations. You'll also notice in Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 8 that this battle will occur as Israel has been regathered from the mount and is living safely in the mountains of Israel. And in prior sessions, I've made reference to my friend Mark Hitchcock, who talks about how prior to 1967, the Six-Day War, there really were no bodacious mountains in the land of Israel. And isn't it interesting that after 1967, Israel got back those mountainous regions? In fact, Israel, under the Trump administration, just got back a mountainous region which forms a buffer zone between Israel and Syria called the Golan Heights. And here you'll see a couple of maps that we have showing you where the Golan Heights are, a mountainous region. And so now Israel has these bodacious mountains annexed within her territory, and it's setting the stage for this end time invasion. Notice that also this invasion will occur when Israel has been brought back to her land, which had been a continual waste. And in a prior session, I drew your attention to Leviticus 26, verse 43, which is a prophecy that as long as Israel was out of that land would be a continual waste. And when Israel went back into that land in 1948, it would begin to prosper. You'll also notice in Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 8 that this invasion occurs while Israel is living securely. What would cause her to live securely? I believe it's Daniel 9 verse 27. A firm covenant has been made between Israel, unbelieving Israel, and the Antichrist, guaranteeing her existence. And that's why I'm placing this battle in the tribulation period itself. You'll notice this chart here, which gives you an overview of the tribulation. And what starts the tribulation is a covenant between the Antichrist and unbelieving Israel. It's when, looking at this chart here, the tribulation judgments, the rider on the white horse has gone forward, conquering and to conquer, a picture of the Antichrist coming forward and entering into a peace treaty with the nation of Israel, guaranteeing her survival. And once that happens, Israel, according to Isaiah 28, verse 15, and verse 18, will have entered into a covenant with Sheol herself, hell itself, because it's a false treaty. It's a false peace. because what will quickly follow is this invasion from the north, from this confederation of nations that we've been trying to describe, and this becomes the tool that God will use to bring unbelieving Israel to faith. Notice verse 9 as we continue on verse by verse. It says, "You will go up, you will come like a storm, you will be like a cloud covering the land, you and all your troops and many peoples." Notice the similes that are used to describe this invading force. It's like a storm. It's like a cloud covering the land. And notice again the reference to many nations or peoples with you. In other words, Ezekiel is not giving an exhaustive list here. It's true he's identified nations in the outer ring, but this could also include nations in the inner ring invading simultaneously. Now, we continue on in our outline and we move away from God's intention to Gog's intention. And notice, if you will, Ezekiel 38 and verse 10. It says, "Thus says the Lord God, it will come about on that day that thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil plan." Now, who puts evil thoughts into people's minds? It's Satan. Satan did this with David in 1 Chronicles 21 and verse 1, where it says, "Then Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to count Israel." David had an idea, but it really wasn't his idea. It was Satan's idea. And that's the kind of thing that's being described here. Satan has always wanted to eradicate Israel. Why? Because of Genesis 12, verse 3, where God has obligated himself to bless the world through Israel. And you'll notice that we have three great blessings, two past and one on the horizon, coming to us through the nation of Israel: the Scripture, the Savior, and one day the Messianic kingdom, which will be located or headquartered in Israel. This is the reason why Satan hates Israel, and this is why Satan puts the thoughts into the minds of these northern invaders to simultaneously come against Israel in the last days. Psalm 83 and verse 4 says, "They have said, 'Come and let us wipe them out as a nation, so that the name of Israel will no longer be remembered.'" And we move from there into verse 11, which says, "And you will say, I will go against the land of unwalled villages. I will go against those who are at rest, that live securely, all of them living without walls and having no bars or gates." Now, it's interesting, you can see from this slide here that there are two Hebrew words used to describe Israel's general peace and rest. There's one word, batak, which essentially is translated unwalled villages. It's describing Israel's security when this invasion occurs. And then you have a completely different word, shakat, which basically means peaceful, quiet, restful, and undisturbed. And what could put Israel in that place of not just security, but tranquility? Because we've got two Hebrew words here. And it would be the covenant, Daniel 9, verse 27, which the Antichrist has made with Israel, guaranteeing her security and her survival, which is the event following the rapture of the church, which will start the 7-year tribulation period. It's interesting that what Ezekiel is describing here is a transition from peace to war. And that's exactly what we see in these seal judgments. The first seal judgment is peace, Revelation 6, 1 and 2, followed by war, Revelation 6, verses 3 and 4. And I believe that this invasion will happen probably towards the beginning of the tribulation period with the opening of seal judgment number 2. Moving on into verse 12, notice what it says: to capture spoil, to seize plunder, to turn your hand against the waste places which are now inhabited, against the people who are gathered from the nations, who have acquired cattle and goods, who live at the center of the world. And you'll look there at verse 12. You'll notice we've got the words spoil, plunder, cattle, and goods underlined, and that is the motivation for the invasion. It's to capture Israel's wealth. And when you interpret that in light of verse 4, I think it was, a little earlier, where it talked about hooks in the jaws, that's the hook that's going to bring Israel the surrounding nations into the land of Israel in the end times. There's a spiritual element. Satan puts thoughts into the minds of the invaders, but there's a naturalistic element as well. The spiritual element is described in verse 10. The natural element of wealth or covetousness is described there in verse 12. So if all of this is true, Israel must become very, very wealthy prior to this invasion. Deuteronomy 33 verse 22 speaks of how Asher will dip his foot in oil. I believe that this is a prophecy about wealth coming to the tribal territory of Asher in the last days. Of course, when you look at this quote here from Mark Twain, which I won't read because I've given this quote to you before, it's simply a description of what he saw in 1867 when he visited what today we call the land of Israel. It wasn't wealthy at all. It was just a barren, desolate expanse. But we're living in a time period where we have seen Israel not only reborn, but she is becoming very, very wealthy. Charles Feinberg, in his Ezekiel commentary, writes this: what is it that will allow the coalition of the nations to descend upon and invade the Holy Land? The plan will be devised because of one important feature of Israel's occupation of their ancestral home, their wealth. How much we hear today on all sides of national security, social security, financial security. Men's minds are occupied with plans for security. Thus, the enemy will see the occupation of the day to invade, overrun with ease, and come off with a handsome prize. For the returned people will have come with much wealth. The enemy, greedy of Israel's wealth, will embark upon a campaign quest for gain. It is now common knowledge that deposits of mineral wealth in the Dead Sea are the greatest in the world. The envious eyes of the foe will be denied no longer. The hour when Israel lives without fear of attack will be considered the most auspicious for the invasion of plunder. It's interesting that today Israel has created a gross domestic product that far outstrips her neighbors. Just a couple of headlines. You'll notice that this particular headline says the value of minerals of the Dead Sea is now estimated at $5 trillion. Notice this article from Todd Strandberg where he talks about huge deposits of natural gas were recently found along Israel's northern coastline. Notice this headline here, which says huge oil discovery in the Golan Heights. And it talks about that discovery there. You'll notice this article by Matthew Krieger from the Jerusalem Post. It says, despite a population of only slightly more than 7 million people, Israel is now home to 7,200 millionaires. I mean, it's very interesting that history has caught up to what Ezekiel predicted. This invasion would occur because of Israel's wealth, and we're now living in a time period where not only has Israel been reborn politically, but she is becoming very, very wealthy, exactly like the book of Ezekiel predicts. You'll notice also in verse 12, that it says at that time, Israel will be living at the center of the nations. Ezekiel's position in the world is frequently described as the center of the world, the center of the nations. You see that also in Ezekiel Chapter 5 and verse 5. Notice this very interesting statement here from Charles Feinberg. He says an interesting phrase is employed to define the place where God's people will be dwelling. It is called the middle, literally the navel of the earth, as explained in chapter 5, verse 5. The land of Israel is in the center of the earth as far as God's purposes for the world are concerned. Rabbinic literature states, quote, as the navel is set in the center of the human body, so the land of Israel is in the navel of the world. Situated in the center of the world in Jerusalem, the center of the land of Israel, and the sanctuary in the center of Jerusalem, and the holy place in the center of the sanctuary, and the ark in the center of the holy place, and the foundation stone before the holy place. So it's interesting how Ezekiel is making statements that even modern day, well, I wouldn't say modern day, but latter rabbinic literature describes as Jerusalem being at the center of the earth. And that's how Ezekiel describes this invasion occurring. These nations are coming, and they're actually coming into the belly button or the navel of the world. That's why we believe that Israel is God's timepiece. William Blackstone wrote in 1908, he says, Israel is God's sundial. If anyone desires to know our place in God's chronology, our position in the great march of events, he says, look at Israel. Israel is God's stopwatch. And when the discussion of the world moves to the nation of Israel, that means you're dealing with the hour hand. When the discussion of the world moves to Jerusalem, that means you're dealing with the minute hand. And when the discussion of the world moves to the Temple Mount, that means you're dealing with the second hand as far as the outworking of God's purposes are concerned. As we drop down to verse 13, notice what it says, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all its villages will say to you, have you come to capture spoil? Have you assembled your company to seize plunder, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, and to capture great spoil? You notice that there are some countries here that don't like this invasion. And they stage what many call a lame protest. They protest the invasion, but they don't do anything practical to stop it. And two of those nations are Sheba and Dedan. Looking again at our ancient names from Ezekiel 38, verses 1 through 9, who are Sheba and Dedan. We believe that Sheba and Dedan, which you can actually locate on a modern map today, represent none other than Saudi Arabia. It's very interesting that Saudi Arabia is part of a group of people that have entered into some accords from the Gulf states with Israel called the Abraham Accords. So it's interesting that Saudi Arabia is one of those lame protesters. They don't like the invasion. Now, watch your headlines very carefully because you'll see Saudi Arabia frequently breaking with the big three, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, concerning Israel. Here's a headline here that says, Saudi prince, quote, "all side with Israel against the Palestinian uprising and Iran." Here's another article from the Times of India, which indicates Saudi Arabia intercepts second Yemen missile in a month. Saudi Arabia on Thursday intercepted and destroyed a ballistic missile fired from war-torn Yemen, state media reported. The second such attack this month, claimed by Iran-backed Houthi rebels. Isn't it interesting how Saudi Arabia typically goes against Iran? Now, that might have something to do with the fact that Saudi Arabia is Sunni Muslim and Iran is Shiite Muslim. But once again, we're living in a time period where history has finally caught up with what Ezekiel predicted. He predicted that Sheba and Dedan would not like the invasion. Now, back to the Abraham Accords. Here's a headline that says, Jared Kushner creates Abraham Accords, foundation to deepen ties between Israel and the Arab world. What are the Abraham Accords? The Abraham Accords essentially are normalization agreements between some Muslim countries and Israel. There's sort of a swap that goes on, and the swap is this: if these Gulf states will recognize the existence of Israel, then Israel will open up to these Gulf states the 4 T's: trade, travel, tourism, and technology. And it's largely anticipated that Saudi Arabia is the next entity to become part of these Abraham Accords. And if that's true, it stands to reason that Saudi Arabia would protest the invasion. You don't want an invasion happening against a nation that you have a normalization agreement with. You'll also notice verse 13. It says, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all its villages will say to you, have you come to capture spoil? It's not just Sheba and Dedan that don't like the invasion. It's Tarshish. There you see Tarshish on our list of ancient names from Ezekiel Chapter 38 and verses 1 through 9. Who is Tarshish? Well, the Ryrie Study Bible tells us, and the Hebrew Lexicon tells us also, that Tarshish is located in the south of Spain near Gibraltar, 2,500 miles or 4,000 kilometers west of Israel and the opposite direction of Nineveh. Tarshish is very interesting. It's where Jonah fled to. You'll see the name Tarshish in Jonah chapter 1 and verse 3. God told Jonah to go preach to Nineveh in the east, and he went the opposite direction to the west, to modern-day Spain. And so we believe that somehow Spain is involved in this lame protest. You'll notice very carefully Ezekiel 38 and verse 13 tells us that it's not just Tarshish involved in the lame protest, it's the merchants of Tarshish. Charles Feinberg, in his commentary on the book of Ezekiel, says the young lions of Tarshish are taken to mean either the strong leaders and princes or greedy rulers of these commercial entities. So it's not just Tarshish or Spain that protests the invasion, it's the business leaders of Spain. Now, let me connect the dots if I could. One of the things that's happened is in the Abraham Accords, Israel has entered into one of those accords with Morocco. You see Israel there, that little red dot, and if you just go west, you'll run into Morocco. And advancing the slides one more time, in this map, you'll see that Morocco is in a trading relationship with Spain. So of course the merchants of Tarshish would protest the invasion because they, through the Abraham Accords, are financially benefiting from Israel, just like Saudi Arabia, Sheba and Dedan are. And that's why Sheba and Dedan and Tarshish are not part of this conglomeration led by the big three, coming from the remote north, but they protest the invasion. I'm of the persuasion that the Abraham Accords are largely setting the stage for this lame protest that we see taking place in verse 13. Notice also verse 13 says, "Have you come to capture spoil? Have you assembled your company to seize plunder and to carry away silver and gold?" Now, some people have criticized our interpretation of this because they say you can't take this literally. Israel doesn't have silver and gold. Well, I would like to draw your attention to a book that my friend Bill Perkins wrote of the Stealing the Mind conferences of Compass Ministries, and he has a 3-part series called Steel on Steel. And in chapter 4 of volume 3, he says something that to me is completely fascinating. He compares the wealth of Solomon and Solomon's time to the lists of wealth that are described in the Bible, particularly Ezra and Nehemiah, that were taken by Nebuchadnezzar into Babylon, and that wealth taken back from Babylon back into the land of Israel in post-exilic times. And he just says, just compare the lists. And you'll see that Israel only took with them a small fraction of all of the Solomonic wealth and gold. And they brought back with them from Babylon only a fraction of that Solomonic wealth and gold. In other words, the Israelis hid the Solomonic wealth and gold somewhere where Nebuchadnezzar couldn't find it. And what could very well happen, it's not something to be dogmatic on, but what very well could happen is there could be a discovery at some point of this wealth and gold from Solomon's time that he hid, and that was hid prior to Nebuchadnezzar's incursion. And that gold and that silver is rediscovered. And that also constitutes part of the incentive for this northern invasion. And so as we're moving through this verse by verse, I'm trying to simply surface things that show that this scenario that Ezekiel saw is credible and it's believable. And you'll notice that we advance in our outline away from invasion planned to the invasion executed. Now, I'm looking at my clock here, and I can see that I'm out of time. And I was hoping to finish chapter 38 in this session. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to do it. So we're going to finish chapter 38 and all of chapter 39 in our next session, as we see that this invasion is not only planned, but it's executed, and then God defeats it, and the end result of it all is God is glorified. So we'll pick this up in our 4th and final session together. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. God bless you.